Alrighty, welcome to the Modern Josephus, and today we're going to go ahead and look at Westward expansion. So, I'm sure he's not going to go back to pre-Civil War much. It's at this point all after the Civil War, so we'll probably be talking about a lot of the immigrants coming in and settling the West, buying property, building farms, things like that. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we?
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we leave behind the world of industry and corporations to talk about the wild, wild West. Spoiler alert! You have died of dysentery. And in the process, we're going to explore how all of us, even those of us who are vegans or eat sustainably produced food, benefit from massive agro-business that has its roots in the wild, wild West. The West still looms large in American mythology as the home of cowboys and gunslingers and houses of ill repute and freedom from pesky government interference, but in fact,
it was probably not as wild as we've been told. Ugh, Mr. Green, why can't America live up to its myths just once?
Because this is America, me from the past, home to Hollywood and Gatsby and Honey Boo Boo. We are literally in the myth-making business.
And John Wayne. Oh, man. I tell you what, some of those John Wayne movies that are even supposed to be historical, they are so off the mark as far as history goes that it is just cringe-worthy to me as someone who likes history. But anyway, let's continue.
So before the Hollywood Western, the myth of the frontier probably found its best expression in Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 lecture, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Turner argued that the West was responsible for key characteristics of American culture, beliefs in individualism, political democracy, and economic mobility. Like, for 18th and 19th century Americans, the Western frontier represented the opportunity to start over and possibly to strike it rich by dint of one's own individual effort, even back when the West was like Ohio. In this mythology, the West was a magnet for restless young men who lit out for the uncorrupted, unoccupied, untamed territories to seek their fortune. But in reality, most Western settlers went not as individuals, but as members of a family or as part of an immigrant group. And
now, I will say that the first people to go out west, I will specify west as far as west of the Mississippi. Because like you said, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, like for instance, my ancestors who came across the ocean in 1740, they went straight out to what was the West then, Western Pennsylvania. Nobody was there, and they went as a family. So there, yes. However, west of the Mississippi, you had a lot of single men go out there. I mean, you have Jim Bridger and John C. Fremont and Lewis and Clark and the men in that expedition, and just Jedediah Smith, and you can name a whole bunch of mountain men who were the first ones to step out into those lands, and they were alone, and they were trapping, they were looking, they weren't coming to farm, they weren't coming to establish a life. And then later on, those who came out west in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, they were going out west, but they didn't settle on the plain. They were going to Oregon, they were going to California, so on and so forth. But a lot of the 49ers were men who were alone and were going out west. You have the Earp brothers, Wyatt Earp and his brothers. They went out west alone to begin with. And there were a lot of men that ended up going out alone. And I would say that the first ones to go out west of Mississippi, were men who were going alone, unlike in the east. Or when, like, Pennsylvania and Ohio was considered the West.
They weren't filling up unoccupied space either, because most of that territory was home to American Indians. Also, in addition to Easterners and migrants from Europe, the West was settled by Chinese people and by Mexican migrant laborers and former slaves. Plus, there were plenty of Mexicans living there already who became Americans with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the whole West as a...
Yeah, Hispanics are really... They have... Because of 1848, they have a really deep connection to being Americans, to being Americans. I mean, they were accepted as U.S. citizens immediately after 1848. And of course, the Tejanos were accepted as, you know, as soon as Texas became a part of the United States, which was before the Mexican War. So Hispanics were always treated a little bit differently with higher status. And a lot of it had to do a lot with just the relationship with Mexico and the United States, and the United States recognizing Mexico as its own country and seeing its people on more equal footing than, say, as they saw even toward Chinese, or even toward of course, Black Americans, which were probably the least appreciated out of all the people groups. But Hispanic Americans that have roots from 1848 or even 1836, when Mexico declared its independence, they just were treated at a whole different level, given a higher status and better economic opportunities and citizenship and so on and so forth.
The place of rugged individualism and independence turns out to be an oversimplification. I mean, the federal government, after all, had to pass the law that spurred homesteading, then had to clear out American Indians already living there, and had to sponsor the railroads that allowed the West to grow in the first place.
But that's in the 1860s on. That's not, you know, before 1860.
It's about as individualistic as the government buying Walden Pond for Henry David Thoreau. What's that? It's a state park now? The government owns it?
What's with him and Thoreau?
Well, there you go. Now, railroads didn't create the desire to settle the West, but they did make it possible for people who wanted to live out West to do so for two reasons. First, without railroads, there would be no way to bring crops or other goods to market. I mean, I guess you could dig a canal across Kansas, but if you've ever been to Kansas, that is not a tantalizing proposition.
And I'm sorry, Kansas, but your state, I've been through it. It is boring. There's nothing to see except for wheat, corn, and crops.
And railroads made life in the West profitable and livable because they brought the goods that people needed, such as tools for planting and sowing, shoes for wearing, books for putting on your shelf and pretending to have read. Railroads allowed settlers to stay connected with the modernity that was becoming the hallmark of the industrialized world in the 19th century.
Now, don't get mad at Kansas, because Indiana, where I'm from, it's pretty boring, too.
Now, we saw last week that the federal government played a key role in financing the Transcontinental Railroad, but state governments got into the act too, often to their financial detriment. In fact, so many states nearly went bankrupt financing railroads that most states now have constitutional requirements that they balance their budgets. But perhaps the central way that the federal government supported the railroads and Western settlement and investment in general was by leading military expeditions against American Indians, rounding them up on ever smaller reservations and destroying their culture.
That is one thing that I will knock against the Grant presidency, was just the way that his administration handled Native Americans. Now, he personally was, most of the treaties, I think, with Native Americans, at least the first treaties with Native Americans, were with Grant. And he was very lenient, promoted their wanted them to keep their land, just wanted settlers to cross over, very lenient with the peace treaties, which is why, many of them signed them. Many chiefs went to go visit him in Washington, D.C. just because they felt confidence in him. The way he wanted his policy to go was pretty well. However, Sherman and Sheridan were just very, even racist. And they were just not very... They didn't carry out the policy. They didn't carry out the peace treaties very well. And that it kind of encapsulates all of Grant's presidency as a whole, just as being very corrupt, people not really listening to him, not taking him seriously, and because he trusted in people too much, and it ended up burning him in the end.
Let's go to the thought bubble. There was an economic as well as a racial imperative to move the Native Americans off their land. White people wanted it. Initially, it was needed to set down railroad tracks and then for farming, but eventually it was also exploited for minerals like gold and iron and other stuff that makes industry work. Would you really want a territory called the Badlands unless it had valuable minerals? Early Western settlement of the Oregon Trail kind did not result in huge conflicts with Native Americans, but by the 1850s, a steady stream of settlers kicked off increasingly bloody conflicts that lasted lasted pretty much until 1890. Even though the fighting started before the Civil War, the end of the war between the states meant a new, more violent phase in the warring between American Indians and whites. General Philip H. Little Phil Sheridan set out to destroy the Indians' way of life, burning villages and killing their horses, and especially the buffalo that was the basis of the Plains tribe's existence. There were about 30 million buffalo in the U.S. in 1800. By 1886, the Smithsonian Institute had difficulty finding 25 good specimens.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Sheridan and Sherman in the Civil War, but once it came to the Indian affair, it was ridiculous.
In addition to violent resistance, some Indians turned to a spiritual movement to try to preserve their traditional way of life. Around 1890, the ghost dance movement arose in and around South Dakota. Ghost dancers believed that if they gathered together to dance and engage in religious rituals, eventually the white man would disappear and the buffalo would return, and with them the Indians' traditional customs. But even though a combined force of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors completely destroyed George Custer's force of 250 cavalrymen at Little Bighorn in 1876, and Geronimo took years to subdue in the Southwest, Western Native Americans were all defeated by 1890, and the majority were moved to reservations. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Boy, this Wild West episode sure is turning out to be loads of fun. It's just like the Will Smith movie. All right, Stan, this is about to get even more depressing, so let's look at like some pretty mountains and western landscapes and stuff while I deliver this next bit. So in 1871, the U.S. government ended the treaty system that had, since the American Revolution, treated Native Americans as if they were nations. And then, with the Dawes Act of 1887, the land set aside for the Indians were allotted to individual families rather than to tribes. Indians who, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life, which in this case meant becoming small-scale, individualistic Jeffersonian farmers, would be granted citizenship, and there were supposed to be some protections to prevent their land from falling out of Native American possession, but these protections were not particularly protective, and much of the Indian land was purchased either by white settlers or by speculators. After the passage of the Dawes Act, Indians lost 86 million of the 138 million acres of land in their possession. Oh boy, it's time for the mystery document.
Yeah, they didn't go for... They didn't buy the land. They didn't try to purchase it. They just kind of ran roughshod over it. So it was... The policy that they carried out was totally different than, you know, the colonial era or even the founding father era. Not that I'm not saying that was perfect, because eventually you had people taking Indian land anyway at the end of the day. But just the idea of purchasing land, I mean, that to me is the fairest way to do it. If you really want that land, you need to purchase it from the people who are sitting on it, you know. Anyway.
The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, and then you get to see me get shocked when I'm wrong. All right. I have seen the great father chief, the next great chief, the commissioner chief, the law chief, and many other law chiefs, and they all say they are my friends and that I shall have justice. But while all their mouths talk right, I do not understand why nothing is done for my people. I have heard talk and talk, but nothing is done. Words do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country now overrun by white men. They do not protect my father's grave. Good words will not give my people a home where they can live in peace and take care of themselves. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all the good words and all the broken promises.
Yeah, and the U.S. government had a lot of broken promises with Native Americans, and there's no defense of that. So let me see if I can guess. I mean, there were a lot of... I could mention a whole bunch of... Obviously, this is a chief, an Indian chief, and he went to go visit all the chiefs in Washington, D.C. I'm going to... it could be Red Cloud, it could be Chief Joseph, it could be Blackfoot, Chief Blackfoot, something like that. It could be the Chief, I forget, Crazy Horse, it could be Chief Sitting Bull, it could be Geronimo. There's a whole bunch of guys who could have said this. Anyway, let's see what it is.
That could be almost any American Indian leader. This is totally unfair, Stan. All I really know about this is that the great father chief is the president. It could be any of a dozen people. How about if I say the name in 10 seconds, I don't get punished? And start. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Geronimo, Chief Bigfoot, Keokuk, Chief Oshkosh, Chief Joseph, Chief... Oh, yes!
Wow.
Yes! And now let us...
Wow, I got on the second one. Chief Joseph, nice.
Move from tragedy to tragedy. So if you're thinking that it couldn't get worse for the Native Americans, it did. After killing off the buffalo, taking their land, and forcing Indians onto reservations, the Bureau of Indian Affairs instituted a policy that amounted to cultural genocide. It set up boarding schools, the most famous of which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where Indian children were forcefully removed from their families to be civilized. This meant teaching them English, taking away their clothes, their names, and their family connections. The idea, put succinctly, was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man.
Yeah, here's my problem. I'm all for missionary effort. My father is a missionary in Mexico. But you can't force conversion. And you shouldn't force conversion. Either from culture or from religion, anything. Your job as a missionary, in the Christian perspective, is to go out and you don't really do the convincing. We believe the Holy Spirit does the convincing. But put that aside. You are only supposed to try to persuade. And leave it up to the individual to make that decision. This forced conversion, this forced taking kids away to put them into Christian schools, because obviously all of these taught Christianity and we're trying to convert, that's not the way to do it. There's a way to do it, and that's just not it. You're supposed to be persuading. For instance, in the early colonial time period, what the missionaries do, they would actually go to Indian villages and try to persuade them to Christianity. Largely successful. It was a largely successful effort, but they persuaded them, Native Americans, to become Christian. They didn't force them. And that's the difference with what we're seeing here. It was more of a forceful thing, and that's just not the way to go. They should have sent missionaries to the Native Americans to try to persuade them, not go and force them.
Now, the U.S. wasn't the only nation busy subjugating its indigenous inhabitants and putting them on reservations in the late 19th century. Like, something similar was happening in South Africa, in Chile, and even to First Peoples in Canada. And you're usually so good, Canada, although the slower pace of Western settlement meant that there was much less bloodshed, so another point to Canada. And as bad as the American boarding school policy was, at least it was short-lived compared with Australia's policy of removing Aboriginal children from families and placing them with white foster families, which lasted until the 1970s. All right, Dan, we need to cheer this episode up. Let's talk about cowboys, the Marlboro man riding the range, herding cows and smoking, solitary in the saddle, alone in his emphysema. Surely that is the actual West, the men and women, but mostly men, who stood apart from the industrializing country as the last of Jefferson's rugged individuals. But no, once again we have the railroad to thank for our image of the cowboy, like those massive cattle drives of millions of cows across open range Texas. Yeah, they ended at towns like Abilene and Wichita and Dodge City because that's where the railheads were. Without railroads, cowboys would have just driven their cattle in endless circles, and without industrial meat processing, there wouldn't have been a market for all that beef.
However, there were cattle drives that went from Texas to Colorado. And if you read the book Centennial, of course it's fiction, but the author is trying to make it historical and put it into fiction. But there were cattle drives that went from Texas to Colorado, and that's not a short cattle drive. That's not. And some went up to Wyoming, from Texas to Wyoming. They were taking Longhorn up to Wyoming. So, I mean, did he miss that part of history or something? I don't know, but.
And it was a lot of beef. You know what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about beef. By the mid-1880s, the days of open-range ranching were coming to an end.
If you hear the Green Bay Packers, the reason why they're Packers is because it would pack meat. And that was meat that was coming from ranches out west.
Ranchers began to enclose more and more land and set up their businesses closer to, you guessed it, railroad stations. There are also quite a few things about Western farming that just fly in the face of the mythical Jeffersonian yeoman farmer ideal. Firstly, this type of agricultural work was a family affair. Many women bore huge burdens on Western farms, as can be seen in this excerpt from a farm woman in Arizona. Get up, turn out my chickens, draw a pail of water, make a fire, put potatoes to cook, brush and sweep half-inch of dust off floor, feed 3 litters of chickens, then mix biscuits, get breakfast, milk, besides work in the house, and this morning had to go half-mile after calves.
I guess they didn't have time for OnlyFans or Instagram, huh?
These family-run farms were increasingly oriented toward production of wheat and corn for national and even international markets rather than trying to eke out subsistence. Farmers in Kansas found themselves competing with farmers in Australia and Argentina, and this international competition pushed prices lower and lower. Secondly, the Great Plains, while remarkably productive agriculturally, wouldn't be nearly as good for producing crops without massive irrigation projects. Much of the water needed for plains agriculture comes from a massive underground lake, the Oglala Aquifer. Don't worry, by the way, the aquifer is fed by a magic and permanent H2O factory in the core of the Earth that you can learn about in Hank's show, Crash Course Chemistry. What's that? It's going dry? My God, this is a depressing episode. Anyway, large-scale irrigation projects necessitate big capital investments and therefore large, consolidated agricultural enterprises that start to look more like agribusiness than family farms. I mean, by 1900, California was home to giant commercial farms reliant on irrigation and chemical fertilizers. Some of them were owned not by families, but by big corporations like the Southern Pacific Railroad. And they were worked by migrant farm laborers from China, the Philippines, Japan, Mexico. As Henry George, a critic of late 19th century corporate capitalism, wrote, "California is not a country of farms, but of plantations and estates." When studying American history, it's really easy to get caught up in the excitement of industrial capitalism with its robber barons and new technologies and fancy cities, because that world looks very familiar to us, probably because it's the one in which we live. After all, if I was running a farm like that Arizona woman I talked about earlier, there's no way I could be making these videos because I'd be chasing my calves. I don't even know what a litter of chickens is. Is it 4 chickens? 12? 16? It's probably 12 because eggs do come in dozens. The massive agricultural surplus contemporary farms create and the efficient transportation network that gets that surplus to me quickly makes everything else possible, from YouTube to Chevy Volts. And no matter who you are, you benefit from the products that result from that massive surplus. That's why we're watching YouTube right now. So agriculture...
That's why we are... we have so many conveniences because of this. All of this. Corporations and large farms and things like that.
And animal husbandry did change a lot in late 19th century
It's why we're a first world country and not a third world country.
America, as we came to embrace the market-driven ethos that we either celebrate or decry these days. And in the end, the Wild West ends up looking a lot more like industrial capitalism than like a Larry McMurtry novel. The Wild West, like the rest of the industrialized world, was incentivized to increase productivity and was shaped by an increasingly international economic system. And it's worth remembering that even though we think of the Oregon Trail and the Wild West being part of the same thing, in fact, they were separated by the most important event in American history, the Civil War. I know that ain't the mythologizing you'll find in Tombstone, but it is true. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, so the Wild West got tamed. Let's just put it like that. It got tamed. It went from being wild to it being tamed after the Civil War. And the world changes and keeps on changing. But perhaps we are reaching the peak. The peak. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the Wild West happened before the Civil War. Of course, when you had the cattle stuff, you did have a lot of the cowboy, your outlaws and all that kind of stuff. And that happened, but it wasn't it wasn't something that lasted a long time. It was there for a small section in history, even compared to the 200 and some years of the United States. But it did happen. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video. Like, share, subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you liked what you watched. And adios.